Good afternoon, and welcome to this edition of Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop, and I am so glad to be able to come to you today to talk about what I've been talking about for good afternoon, and welcome to this edition of Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop, and I am so glad. Okay, I need to take that from the top again. Good afternoon, and welcome to this edition of Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop, and I am so glad to be able to come to you on this day to talk to you about a shift happening for you. As you know, since February, I have been talking about this book called Everyday Ubuntu, and it has been such a blessing for me. And I shared it all the way through the month of February and into the month of March. And I am continuing with this series. And so I'm glad that you tuned in today to hear about Everyday Ubuntu as we carry on this particular series. Ubuntu is really this idea that started way back in Africa. So a lot of times when we think about Black history and Black History Month, we talk about it post like our history just started here in this United States. But when we look back over the trajectory, it is something that lives in us and has lived in us the entire time, even prior to that Middle Passage stage. And so while we may not have a conscious memory of it, when I share these principles with you, you'll see as we talk about them a little bit more that it is something that has always been present in your awareness. And so we've talked a bit as we've gone through about different principles. You can always go back and listen to those. If you are interested, they are, for the most part, up on my Facebook page because I have been recording them off and on for months now. And if you are interested in hearing those, you can go back and hear some of the back lessons, or better yet, you can just buy the book, Everyday Ubuntu, and read it for yourself. So, one of the principles as we keep carrying on through this particular book is this idea that changing your mind is possible. Now, I will tell you, when I first read A Course in Miracles, one of the things that struck me is that it said, in essence, this idea that an untrained mind can accomplish little. And most of the time, we don't think about the things that we have learned. And most of the time, it's because we are not necessarily intentional with our learning. And so we think about this idea of learning in a number of ways, but not necessarily organized. As children, when we are children, we start off and we learn by example what we see around us, the people that are around us, and the things that they do. We naturally pick up things and absorb things like sponges. And so even now, when you think about um, how we are learning things in a number of ways. So, so, um, so, so when you think about it in several different ways, when you think about it, we learn things and we learn it unintentionally. We learn it and didn't necessarily mean to learn it, or we haven't really discerned how it shows up in our life, what it is supposed to mean in our lives. And so, if you don't like the way something looks, or if you don't like the way that you're responding to it, you can always change those things. And it becomes necessary for us to look at and figure out if it is something that we want to keep or something that we want to release and throw away. Let me give you an example. When I was younger, I used to think that that there was a particular way I wanted to be in the world. And I would, kind of have my head and hold my head in a particular kind of way and act as if people were beneath me and I was walking around like royalty. I thought that that was what positive self-esteem looked like. But it wasn't until I really started thinking about how I wanted people to respond to me. I watched other people who were out in public, and what I noticed was is that they had a quick smile and that people tended to gravitate towards them. And if I was really honest with myself, I would ask the question, well, wait a minute, why aren't I having the same type of experience? And what I discovered was is that if I wanted to experience people differently, the change wasn't necessary for them to make, but it was necessary for me to make. So what I started to do was to smile more. There is a line in the play Hamilton that's when Burke asked if he could give Hamilton some advice. He said, "Talk less, smile more," right? And never let a person know what you are against or what you're for. And it was in that instant that I really started to think about how I wanted to be received and perceived. And so what I did was is I started to be more intentional with my personality, how I approached people, the way I smiled. And as my grandmother used to always say, if I wanted to have friends, I needed to show myself friendly. This is just one way of discovering that you have within you the power to change your personality, to change the way that you engage in public. And when you begin to change the way that you engage with other people, what you will see is that things begin to change for you. So your own way of being is something that you have control over and something that you can change. And so when you start thinking about that and the implications that it has overall for your life, right? And not just in ways you show up in a room and your personality, but you can change so many different things, even in the context of your relationships, your friendships, how you are with your family. I remember when I decided that I was no longer going to struggle up against my father and try to convince him to be different than he was. I can't change anybody, but what I can do is I can change myself. I can control how I engage. And so, this idea of really investigating some of the things that you are doing, some of the things that you're saying, the ways that you're engaging, it puts you in a position of power. Ubuntu teaches us that not everyone will share the views that you share. There's all kinds of things that influence who you are and how you show up. Your values can be based on your upbringing, your life experiences, the communities that you are involved with, personality traits. There are so many things that goes into who you are and how you engage with the world. And so naturally, it makes sense to sort of look at some of the factors that are involved and really investigate it and ask yourself the question about them. Is this perspective true? Is it truthful? Or is there some wiggle room in here? Is there a way that I might have been mistaken about some of the core things that motivate the way that I see the world and the way that I engage with others? Can you imagine how it is that if at a certain point in your life, you look around and you find that the things you had built your house upon were not quite true? It's like the old example that we've heard a time and time again about the woman who was, teaching her daughter or yeah, her daughter about making a roast. And she talked about this roast and how the proper way to cook it was to cut each of the tips of the ends off before you season it and put it in the pan. And she talked about the ways in which, you do the roast. And so her daughter asked her, is she was like, well, why do you cut the ends off? And she says, well, I don't know. That's the way my mother always did it. And so that's how I continue to do it. And it makes the roast so good and tender and juicy. And so finally, the daughter goes back and she asked her grandmother, Grandma, why do what's the significance of cutting the tips off of the roast? And the grandmother shrugged and she says, well, so it would fit in the pan I had. The pan I had wasn't big enough, and so I cut the tips off in order to make the roast fit. Well, see, armed with more information, you could then figure out or find out why it was that you were always doing something. Just because you've always doesn't mean that it is the most expedient or the best way to do it. And armed with a little more insight and information, you can then decide if this still fits or works for you. Things change over time. And it's important to recognize that part of what we do is that when we have new awareness or new information, it requires us to do something different, to do something more. So I would just encourage you to think about that. Um, there's a psychologist listed in this book, Carol Dweck, in 1970. She showed that there were two different types of mindset: a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is where a person believes basic qualities, their talents, their intelligence are all fixed traits. Or you could have a growth mindset. And a growth mindset is where a person's qualities or their traits can change if they make a concerted effort to change them. So if you work hard, if you make goals, if you put out targets, if you do different things, really being introspective about what it is that you're doing and how you show up in the world, all of those factors can contribute to this growth mindset. So do you think that you're fixed? Do you think that you have a fixed mindset? Or do you have a growth mindset? Those are all things that you can ask yourself when you're thinking about the changes that you might want to see in your life, the things that you might want to do. And this is not to say that what you've done so far is wrong or has not worked. It's to simply say that at every moment we can expect to grow and change if we have that growth kind of mindset. But if you are thinking that this is how I am, kind of like Popeye the Sailor Man, I am what I am. If you're believing that you are fixed, that you cannot change, then that will be the way that you are until you decide something different. We all can do something different. I learned how to put on a happy face. I learned how to be more outgoing. I've seen it happen to people that I know and people that I love and have deep respect for. There is no limit to what you can do when you decide to make some changes in your life. Oh, I think it's so good. I think it's so good. And I hope that you might, if it fits, that you might also think about what it is that who you are and what it is that you bring to the table. Hey, you're listening to Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop. Don't go anywhere. I will be right back. Welcome back. Welcome back. You're listening to Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop, and I am so glad that you're there. I'm so glad that I get a chance to talk to you today. I'm still talking about this book, Everyday Ubuntu. And Everyday Ubuntu of course, it started out just one of those books. I just saw it and thought it was interesting. And then as I started to read it, I thought, oh, this is something good that I can share. And it resonated with me to the degree that I can say that unbeknownst to me, it's almost as if it was familiar in a way that I did not expect. And so I'm so happy that I get a chance to share this with you. So, one of the principles that was shared was this idea that when you're looking at things from a distance, it makes it easier to see. Now, I have to tell you guys this because I remember when this concept first came to me. One of the things I found very interesting was is I used to talk about it in terms of everything that we see in life, right? When things are up close on you, it is hard to gain perspective over it. As a matter of fact, when you are reading, if there is not spaces between the letters and then spaces between the words, it just looks like a pile of letters and it makes absolutely no sense. But when you are able to look at a page and see the words spaced out, not only spaced out in, with spaces in between them, but then there's a period and then there's another sentence and then there's a paragraph and then there's a page and then there's a chapter and then there's all of these things. It requires that we get space in order to see something. It's really hard to see things when you're holding a piece of paper up an inch away from your face. You need to bring it away from you in order for you to see it. So, this idea of looking from a distance makes it easier for us to see the bigger picture. If you can imagine walking up to a forest or some woods, and if you have one perspective, say for instance, I'm standing directly in front of it, I can't see how massive it is without giving myself some distance or backing up or maybe getting an aerial view or something else. You see, a lot of times we think that we can see things effectively, but it becomes really hard when it's so close. We've all had relationships, I'm sure, relationships and friendships that crowd you so much that you don't have a time or space to think about them or consider whether or not this is working for you. Sometimes we get caught up, especially when, say, for instance, there is something and it seems as though you get swept away. Sometimes in new relationships, those first few months, we're so enamored and so in love that we can't see anything but how special and wonderful this is. But sometimes it's just backing up a little bit, giving yourself some space or some room that allows you to gain perspective and to see more clearly. So, if you are at any point struggling to gain perspective, and that perspective can come, as you can see, as I've shown you here, in any number of ways. Sometimes it's on the job, sometimes it's in a relationship, sometimes it is in reading, sometimes it's in studying, sometimes it's in so many different ways. We have to be able to ask ourselves questions, which sometimes means that we have to step back or step out of a situation. I don't know about you, but there have been times that I have been so hopelessly caught up in a situation that I did not have the ability to gain clarity through to it or bring clarity to it because it was so personal to me. So sometimes what we have to do is just allow some space. And that space allows us to see more clearly. And in seeing more clearly, we might have a change of heart, a change of perspective, or something else that would happen. Will this same thing last? If you think about it from that perspective, I had a girlfriend who used to tell me often about her 80-year-old test, and she would ask the question that if will this matter to me when I turn 80 years old? And for her, since that was at such a far distance, she could think about it rationally and think to herself, like, well, I don't even think I'll remember this at 80. There are things that sometimes we are so when it's right up in our face, we're so angry or we're so upset or we think that it's so important. But if we ask ourselves these simple little questions, will this matter next week, next month, next year, or when I'm 80? Will it matter? And that allows us to look at it differently, to give ourselves some space, to let up off of it so that we're not so anxious about it. This too shall pass is one of those terms that I learned when I went to Vipassana. When I went to Vipassana, they talked about this idea of being equanimous, meaning not to get upset, not to cling to things, not to hold on to them too tightly, because this too shall pass. And so when you are thinking about that, whatever it is that is your problem at the moment, whatever is vexing you, whatever it is that is upsetting you, nothing comes to stay. It all comes to pass. If we look out in nature, nothing stays the same. It all comes to pass. Change is inevitable. Change will occur whether you like it or not. And sometimes you just have to back up and trust that the process is working itself out. And so if you are struggling in any area, you can set up ways in which you can begin to bring perspective for yourself, right? By asking yourself, will this matter? Asking if I know this is going to pass, or if I know that whatever this is going to work itself out, is there some wiggle room that I can find in here? And so when you are able to gain perspective in that regard, maybe you can back up off of a situation so that you're not so caught up and so anxious or angry about a particular thing. Focus in on the things that you have that are really good. Sometimes we forget that how to be grateful in the moment. We are so busy being angry and upset about things that we forget about the goodness of them. Sometimes I have to remind myself how much I love and appreciate the people that are in my life, because sometimes we get caught up on the anger that we feel towards them rather than the appreciation. And when we shift into an attitude of gratitude or appreciation for them, what allows us to do is to maybe think about, oh, is this where I need to go with this thought or this feeling? So focus on what has been given to you rather than what is being, whatever the challenge may be. Focus in on what is good. There is an ancient African proverb that talked about this idea of always remembering the good that a person has done instead of focusing in on what is bad. Sometimes we think about what we don't have rather than what we do have. And when we begin to shift our mindset and be more appreciative of what is there, we're not so quick to criticize it. Sometimes people are upset especially when you're comparing yourself to another. You're upset about, your car or your job or your house or your maid or something else. And when we hold up things in comparison to others, it may seem as though it falls short. This is perspective, right? And so sometimes all we need to do is shift into gratitude And when we shift into gratitude, what we're able to see is not the things that we're focused in on and criticizing, but all that is beautiful and wonderful about what you do have, what is there. Be thankful for what you have. I can remember a song back in the 70s. As a matter of fact, every once in a while, I'll hear it today. And it is, diamond in the back, sunroof top, digging in the seam with a gangster lean. Remember that song? Ooh. And there's a refrain in there that says, you may not have a car at all, but remember, brothers and sisters, you can still stand tall. Just be thankful for what you have, right? And so it is something that we have always been told, and maybe we hear that refrain going on in our minds, but somehow in the moment it seems as though we forget. We forget. Somebody would talk about this idea that, we moan about our shoes until we see somebody that doesn't have feet or that has somehow had an amputation or that can't walk. We have to learn how to be thankful and practice this idea of gratitude. Sometimes what we need to do is give what we want, because giving what you want then opens you up to receive what you want. I know it sounds counterintuitive, that this idea that if I am in desire of something, I need to give that. It sounds like it would be the exact opposite. But what it does is it primes the pump. We've got to pour something in. And when we pour something in, we get something amazing out. So try something different. Shake things up a little bit. And maybe what you will see is that some of the things that you were thinking were missing have been there all along. Or somebody else comes and tells you how special they see what you have is in you, things that you didn't even know were there. It's always amazing to me when people are talking to me and they talk about all of this amazing, amazing stuff. And I'm sitting there and sometimes you forget and you take things for granted. So try something new or try something different. Practice a little gratitude. Do something a little different. And when you do, what you see is things begin to change for you. Don't go anywhere. You are listening to Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop. I'm so glad that you're here and that I get to talk to you about everyday Ubuntu. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Welcome back. You are listening to Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop, and I am so glad that you are there and I get to talk to you today about this everyday Ubuntu. I have been talking about this because it has just been such a blessing in my life. And so, as I move forward through this amazing sharing, it is really interesting because there's so many opportunities that we have to even change how we see the world. Now, her next lesson that comes from this book is have dignity and respect for yourself and others. Now, I know some of you, this is just the way in which you maneuver in the world. In here, it is Chinua Achebe. There's a quote that came from him right here in this book, Everyday Ubuntu. And it says, African people did not hear of culture for the first time from Europeans. Their societies were not mindless, but frequently had a philosophy of great depth and value and beauty. They had poetry, and above all, they had dignity. And it is so true. Just because somebody doesn't value what it is that you bring to the table does not mean that it is valueless. And so when we start to look at some of the perspectives that have come up through us, that are natural to us, we find that we have these natural ways of seeing the world and seeing ourselves because there has always been a connectedness. We've been connected to the land, connected to nature, and connected absolutely to one another, and couldn't imagine a world where we were seeing it separate. As a matter of fact, just like many indigenous cultures, people of African descent didn't even have this awareness that the land could be owned by some, that it belonged to all was something that they always had. So sometimes when we look at this from an Ubuntu perspective, what we're trying to do is bring respect and dignity to everyone, regardless of whether or not we agree with their perspective or not. If a person respects himself or herself, they are far more likely to extend that respect to other people. However, if you do not, what you tend to do is devalue other people. Where you find out where your value lies in what you find as your way, the principal way that you relate to others. Are you more concerned with how much money you make off of a person or what you can get from them than the person themselves? And so when you look at that, sometimes you find that it is because you don't value yourself in a way that is in seeing yourself as valuable, but rather the stuff that you have. So Martin Luther King talked about this idea that we had become a thing-oriented society rather than a person, people-oriented society. And there has always been a danger in that. So here in this book, she offers us to go back to Desmond Tutu's words. He says, "We believe that a person is a person through other persons, that my humanity is caught up and is inextricably bound to yours. I cannot be separate from you. And when I dehumanize you, I inexorably dehumanize myself because of the oneness that we share." And so, by this logic, she says, respect begins within you. When you learn how to respect yourself, your a respect for others grows out of that same respect naturally. So, however, she says, isn't looking after oneself the idea of self-care a selfish type of act? Is it the same as looking after number one, meaning that we're putting ourselves first and above all, above others? Ubuntu has caught me in this. So, Ubuntu means believing in other people, regardless of who they are and what their role is in life. Everyone is the same and deserves respect. So it's not based on how much education you have, or how much money, or where you live, or your race, or your sex, or your gender preference, or who you lay down with at night. It's not based on any of that stuff. It is based on the fact that you are. And sometimes people are really, especially when they have felt devalued and unseen themselves, when they put their things up above people, people have a really hard time making that stretch. But this is something that comes from within you. It is an indwelling sense of respect and personhood. Sometimes we see people who get caught up and I will say in this idea of race consciousness, they get caught up. You can just imagine for a moment how people get caught up in a particular situation. Sometimes people are on a job, and on their jobs, it seems as though there is a hierarchy. And without even recognizing that you're doing it, sometimes you play into those hierarchical roles and begin to look down on people that you believe to be beneath you. Well, it doesn't take much of an awareness or effort to me to get called out on those types of behaviors. At a particular point, you might see it in the face of those that are around you. I can't tell you how many times I have run into people who talk about how they work on a job in these hierarchical roles, and people who are in the in certain positions can't even bother to acknowledge or speak or nod a hello. It's almost as if they are walking around invisible to certain people. That in and of itself is not only dehumanizing for the person who is being ignored, but what does it do to the person who, who is doing the ignoring? When you think about it from a different perspective, not only does it hurt another person not to be seen, acknowledged, valued for what they do. It may not be what you do, but for what they do, they do deserve to be honored and respected and seen. Now, I will say that just like the person who you've done that to, there is something within you that then is disconnected or cut off from the bigger perspective or from the bigger whole. Can you imagine that that all of us want to be seen, acknowledged, and heard. And the moment that we do that to any one person, it damages not just maybe them, but it damages us as well. And so this idea of just being concerned with yourself and not how you move through the world can be very limiting. It can narrow your scope. And as a matter of fact, the very things that you ignore can be those things that come back to bite you or haunt you later. So open up, perhaps, and see the world that is all around you. Be aware that you can learn from and connect to any number of people just just simply by opening up and having an anticipation that everything you encounter for your highest and best good. That this is not here to trip you up or to somehow diminish you, but rather every encounter is a special encounter. Every person that you meet has the opportunity to either receive a blessing or be a blessing. And so I have been so enamored with this idea of being able to see and treat everyone with dignity and respect. So we don't get to pick and choose the people who show up on our scene, right? I don't know if I want to say unfortunately or fortunately, but things come to us for our growth and for our highest and best good. And when we have an anticipation that life is here and is operating for us, then it makes us open our eyes and greet what is to come with an air of expectancy and love. And I love that. And because one of the things that I do, even sometimes when I meet perfect strangers, I am looking at them like with an attitude of is, I know you got a blessing for me. And when I know you got a blessing for me, I just need to keep digging until you and I find that blessing. And so it becomes a treasure hunt. So I'm able to talk to perfect strangers with the air of, what do I want to say, of curiosity and excitement. And when I'm curious and excited and I'm asking questions and looking for the commonality or the trait, maybe even when I share my own stories, what happens is something very beautiful unfolds. And it can be healing to everyone involved. Just recently, I was talking to a group of people in a training that I was doing, and I mentioned a story which opened up and led somebody else to share their story. And then somebody else shared their story. And people began to open up and share stories that were near and dear to them. People who had worked together for years and had never heard some of the things that they were hearing in that particular instance. And so it created a different level of relation and friendship just in sharing stories, things that maybe people were, because sometimes we hold our cards so close to our chest so that nobody else sees them, and other people get the perception or the idea that somehow you're perfect, that you don't suffer from the things that other people suffer from. But when you open up and you begin to share stories, what you see is that we are far more similar than we are different. And that is a beautiful thing. It's a healing thing. So I love this idea of us being who we are for others and not just for ourselves. Don't go anywhere. You are listening to Shift Happens, because when you get one new idea, one new thought, a shift really can happen for you. I'm Sandra Bishop. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Welcome back. You are listening to Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop, and I am so glad that I am here and that I am with you today. I love sharing from this book, Everyday Ubuntu, Ubuntu, Ubuntu. It's an African word, and it is a beautiful sentiment. I just moved into a new thing where she says, you cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot pour from an empty cup. I love that idea. It is really interesting because we have heard this so often before. And sometimes we do forget that you cannot pour from an empty cup. And so when you think about what that means, sometimes what we have to do is we have to fill our own cup first. Fill your own cup first, and then you have something to give. It's not just about you always being in a receiving mode. Sometimes what we do is we get confused about that. Sometimes we see people, and I know I see it every single day, people who take, and never have the energy or the awareness that they too also have something to give and can give and should actually give. It's amazing because a lot of times what we think is we get caught up in this idea about, it just being about you and only you, without ever realizing that you have to be able to give from a full cup, and the responsibility to fill your own cup is yours. And so one of the things that she points out in this book is this idea about the safety lesson that is given out at the beginning of every plane ride. At the beginning of every plane ride, a steward or stewardess stands up in the middle row and they will go over safety protocols and procedures with you. They'll hold up several things, emergency items, and they'll explain how, in case of a pressure, a drop in pressure in the cabin, an oxygen mask will fall down right in front of you. It doesn't matter that it looks like there is nothing in the bag. When it drops down, they tell you to put your mask on first. Even if you have a child that is flying with you, you put your mask on first. And then once you put your mask on, you can see how to help somebody else put theirs on. You see, sometimes people pass out trying to help somebody else, and they have not first did what they needed to do. As a matter of fact, I've told people before that when you eat, my stomach doesn't get full. And so I need to eat my own food first. I need to make sure that I am feeding myself so that I put myself in a situation where I can help another. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You have got to learn how to take care of yourself. She shares a story in here where she says that her mother learned this lesson, that her mother was a single mother, and while working and being committed to activism work for peace and for the race and for gender equality, she is one of the most selfless people that she knew, but she rarely took time out for herself. Her lifestyle exhausted her. And so one evening she was talking about, all of this stuff, and she was bit due to give a speech, and she hadn't really done anything to really rest up and to acknowledge that she needed to take time out to fill her own cup. Sometimes it looks like we are burning the candle at both ends. And what does it mean when we burn the candle at both ends? We are so busy working that we never do what we need to do to step back and take care of ourselves. In her particular instance in here, she talks about a time when her mother was due to give a speech and she had been running, 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 running. And at a certain point, when she ran into this meeting where she was supposed to be, she runs in and she's busy trying to get everything all straightened out and and get prepared for her thing. And a speaker that was supposed to be on the same schedule, on the same thing that her mother was supposed to be on, comes waltzing in as if on a breeze, and she asked where her dressing room was, and said that she needed to go and get herself together before she got up to speak. She was taking time out to take care of herself. And her mother, she says, was sitting there looking as if, wait a minute, was that an option? Sometimes this idea of just taking a step back and giving ourselves permission to get it together, to pull things together so that we can then, even if it's just 15 or 20 minutes, taking those initial moments is something that helps us and it rejuvenates our spirit. I know this so well because in college, I used to be one who would cram for an exam. I would cram. And what did we do? We learned that this idea of cramming, we thought that it worked. Sometimes we would pull all-nighters, sitting up, studying, trying to get the material down, only to go and in the midst of trying to go and take the test after we've crammed all night, we get there and can't remember a thing. Well, what I discovered is that if I go and I study, right, and I study without sleeping on it, that information just dissipates, just like fog when the sun comes out. It just goes. Whew. But what I've also found out is if I study, if I just skim, I don't even have to cram as hard, and I go to sleep on it, something miraculous and major happens for me. When I get to sleep on it, it's as if it seals it in. That moment of rest, that moment of just going to sleep does something with my mind and my ability to retain information. They've done studies on it, right? I didn't need a study to tell me. The proof was in the pudding. The proof was in what I did. We have a lived experience, and that lived experience can show us certain truths if we are paying attention. Sometimes people don't pay attention at all to the things that are happening in their lives. So it becomes hard to make these types of assessments. But when you're paying attention to what's going on in your life, what you find out is just taking these few moments to take care of self makes all the difference in the world. So when we start to ask ourselves the questions about what it is that we're doing, what it is that we're bringing to a situation, we show or we demonstrate who we are by the care we take with ourselves. Our calm disposition speaks volumes. Our control over situations speaks volumes. Our willingness to rest when we need to rest speaks volumes. It is something that not only we need to consider for ourselves, but demonstrate for those that might be watching us so that they too can see how this works and that it works for them. So when you start to think about this idea of Ubuntu, and think about what it is that needs to happen for you. Think in terms of, I need to take care of myself. And when I am able to take care of myself, I am better able to see how I can help another take care of themselves. You guys, we reach our fullest potential when we are nourished, when we are rested, when we do the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves. Charity begins at home. If you are operating from an empty cup, you are pouring from tainted, right? From tainted water. If water even comes out, don't try to pour from an empty cup, but rather figure out what it is that nourishes your soul and then do that. Hey, you've been listening to Shift Happens. I'm your host, Sandra Bishop, and I'm so glad that you joined me today.